So if there are people still coming in, there are a couple of scattered seats in here, but good afternoon. I am Dean Sue Curry, and I'm just delighted to welcome you, first of all, to the start of a new school year and to our College of Public Health's Distinguished Faculty Lecture. This annual lecture marks our first collegiate-wide event of the academic year, so I particularly want to extend a special welcome to all of our new students, faculty, and staff who are joining us. I look forward to working with you all as we begin another exciting and productive year. I'd also like to invite everyone to a reception in the atrium following today's lecture, where you'll have the opportunity to meet new colleagues and catch up with fellow students and colleagues. So today's distinguished faculty lecture is about global climate change, which is a very hot topic, so to speak, particularly the last week, and it's very frequently in the news. Just a few weeks ago, Gina McCarthy, the new administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, made her inaugural speech and announced that climate change will be the agency's top priority. Around the same time, a new study was in the headlines because it linked hotter temperatures to increased violence. That is not a hint for today. The focus of today's lecture is also on the public health implications of climate change, specifically the effects on respiratory health, and is presented by Dr. Peter Thorne, who is professor and head of the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health. And I want to take some time and tell you a little bit about Peter, and you'll understand I'm looking at him through the world, which is kind of cool, and you'll understand why he is so worthy of our distinguished lectureship. Dr. Thorne is recognized internationally for his research on the adverse effects of inhaled bioaerosols and their relationship to asthma and environmental lung diseases. He holds a Master of Science degree in biomedical engineering and a PhD in environmental toxicology, both from the University of Wisconsin. He joined the University of Iowa faculty as a child in 1988. Dr. Thorne currently directs the Environmental Health Sciences Research Center, which is funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Within that center, Dr. Thorne serves as the director of the Pulmonary Toxicology Facility and co-leader of the Nanotoxicology Research Cluster. He is also the associate program director of the Interdisciplinary Graduate Program in Human Toxicology at the University of Iowa. Dr. Thorne was honored in 2010 with the John Dewey Award from the Central States chapter of the Society of Toxicology, and he has served on a wide variety of editorial and review boards for scientific journals, academic institutions, and government agencies, including the EPA's Scientific Advisory Board. Most recently, he was chosen to serve on the National Research Council's Board of Environmental Studies and Toxicology, which is the principal unit for organizing and overseeing studies of environmental pollution problems affecting human health, human impacts on the environment, and the assessment and management of related risks to human health and environment. Peter is also very committed to translating science to the public through activities such as providing student laboratory experiences, speaking to community groups, participating on public radio shows and videos. We are very proud of his commitment to community engagement, which is one of our college's 3 collective areas of excellence, along with rural health and comparative effectiveness research. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Thorne to come around the world and present the 2013 Distinguished Faculty Lecture, Protecting Respiratory Health in a Changing Climate. David, meet Goliath.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Dean Curry, colleagues, students, friends and family, and even some surprise family that came, and guests of the College of Public Health. I'm making noise that I don't think that they should make there. Okay. I'm extremely honored to deliver this 2013 Distinguished Faculty Lecture to inaugurate the beginning of this academic year of the School of Public Health. I want to thank several people, especially Dr. Corey Piqueza for nominating me for this award. During the talk, I'll take the opportunity to discuss what I feel is the most significant public health challenge that we face and that our children will face, and that's the Goliath of global climate change. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge several people who've served as mentors and friends over many years at the University of Iowa. And I also want to thank the college for hosting this as an indoor event on this scorching day. I'm hot enough as it is. So, I was hired to the University of Iowa 25 years ago next month. And this was by the Chair of Preventive Medicine and Environmental Health, Dr. Bob Wallace, and the head of the Division of Occupational and Environmental Health, Dr. Jim Merchant. And if you look at the photo on the left, you'll see that they took quite a risk. Is it that one? So the comment about me being hired as a mere child is, I think, quite apt, really. So members of the search committee at the time were Kelly Dunham, Betsy Chrischillis, and Laura Fortes, who 25 years later are still faculty in this college. Well, you'll notice in 1988, I had no rollover protection structure and only 3 wheels on my tractor. And I dare say that I'm now driving a little bit more horsepower than I was 25 years ago. And I have to credit my advancement to the great collaborations I've had, not just with my faculty colleagues, but with my graduate students, postdocs, research staff, and academic staff. They have really helped me learn the stuff I needed to know to be a quality researcher. And in particular, I want to single out Dean Sue Curry and former Dean Jim Merchant, who've been particularly influential mentors over this time. And I thank them for the wonderful opportunities they have given me. So thank you very much, Sue. Okay, well, I'd like to begin my presentation with a question posed in an August 2010 New York Times story. Is weather chaos linked to warming? And I think we need to figure out what's causing this. Let me try that and see if it's less. Okay, is that good, Ray? Okay, let me try it. I'll try it. Okay, so the article shown here featured photos from flooding in Pakistan, wildfires in Russia, and severe storms and heat waves in the United States. And over the past 30 years, we've seen unprecedented changes in the climate that will become more extreme and will force significant ecological and human adaptation. So I'd like to recount several of these disasters as examples of this new climate paradigm. So let's start with Pakistan. So here's a map of Pakistan. In May 2010, the temperature in southern Pakistan hit 128 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 53 degrees Celsius. This was a record for Asia, and this added significant glacial melt on top of torrential rains in the northern mountains. So by July 2010, the Indus River went out of its banks and flooded 1/5 of the country of Pakistan, killing thousands and displacing millions. Pakistan has not invested in its infrastructure and was certainly not prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. So at this time, while Pakistan was underwater, some 3,000 miles away, central Russia was experiencing an extreme heat wave and a drought with massive forest and peat fires and loss of the wheat crop. Moscow experienced its highest temperatures in recorded history and saw levels of airborne particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and ozone that were 10 times normal and were more than 5 times above the 3-year regulatory limit for the United States. The morgues in Moscow were over capacity with 350 excess deaths per day. And this was attributed by climatologists, this event, to a blocking anticyclone in the low atmosphere, normally winds coming from the northwest, were now coming from the southeast. So this is another event, and we ask, is weather chaos such as this linked to global warming? And then the other question, of course, is it of human origin? Evidence that's mounting says yes, and with an ever-increasing degree of certainty. So when did concern over anthropogenic or human-caused climate change begin? Was it with the 2006 movie An Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore? Or was it with the debate over the Kyoto Protocol in 1997? Well, let me introduce Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist and Nobel laureate who lived from 1859 to 1927. In 1896, Arrhenius published his observations that certain gases released to the atmosphere, especially carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, absorb and emit radiation, warming the earth and making it suitable for the growth of flora and fauna. He surmised that the proper equilibrium of these greenhouse gases is necessary to ensure a habitable temperature on the earth. Turned out Arrhenius also didn't like the cold weather of Sweden, so he thought that the greenhouse effect would be great for Sweden if it got worse, because it would make it a more comfortable climate for him and would also improve the prospects for agriculture in Sweden. Another seminal figure in the climate science story is Guy Callender. He spent several years, and for the students here, by hand, analyzing 55 years of climate data gathered around the world, and he published his findings in a very important seminal article entitled The Artificial Production of Carbon Dioxide and Its Influence on Temperature. And in that article he wrote, and I quote, "Few of those familiar with the natural heat exchanges of the atmosphere, which go into the making of our climates and weather, would be prepared to admit that the activities of man could have any influence upon phenomena of so vast a scale. I hope to show that such influence is not only possible, but is actually occurring at the present time." This was 1938. Well, through a vast amount of study that's been conducted by thousands of climate scientists over the last 3 or 4 decades, we now have a clearer understanding of the role of greenhouse gases in global climate change and their profile over the last 2,000 years as measured from air that's trapped in ice cores, and that's shown on the left, and from real-time data such as those collected since 1958 at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. If you look at this plot on the left, the carbon dioxide is in the red, and it's to this scale. You see 2,000 years ago at about 280 parts per million, and really throughout history up to the Industrial Revolution, it stays pretty much at that level. And then starting with the Industrial Revolution and the use of increased energy for industry, you see this dramatic increase. And this is paralleled with 2 of the other profound greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. And so you see the CO2 concentration at this observatory in Hawaii going up and up and up. And just recently, earlier this summer, we passed 400 parts per million, which is a benchmark number for climate change. This rapid increase is very concerning and must be addressed. Now, at the heart of the climate change problem is population. So, looking at the population now and to the future, William Ryerson, writing in the Post-Carbon Reader, refers to population as the multiplier of everything else. Since the resources are finite, so is the population that can be sustained. So let's look at these population data. Shown here is a plot of the estimated and projected world population, and I put up here some milestones from the past. So it took about 10,000 years to go from 10 million people to 1 billion people on the Earth, and this milestone was reached in 1804. And then, over time, the next billion was reached 123 years later, and each billion was added in fewer and fewer years. We now sit at a population of 7.1 billion people. So with a lens to the future, most demographers expect a diminishing growth rate, so that's the good news, but yet the population will increase. So some apocalyptics talk of a future with a century of famine and a dramatically lower population by 2100. The more optimistic view is a stabilization of our population at some number like 8 to 10 billion people. So the question to ask is, how does this number of 8 to 10 billion go with our notion of sustainability? So the pertinent question we ask is, what is the carrying capacity of the Earth? I was talking with David Osterberg the other day about Paul Ehrlich's work and the influence that the population bomb had on people of his generation. Paul and Anna Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, and in that they stated that the Earth's resources were already at their limit. The population at that time was 3.6 billion, or about half of what we have today. Now, here a more recent analysis states that humans have outgrown the sustainable capacity of the planet by 40%. So this suggests a limit to population of about 5 billion. And it means that we are living as though we have about 1.5 of these instead of the 1 that we've got. So these latter data, it turns out it's very difficult to calculate accurately a carrying capacity of the Earth, but the efforts have been remarkable. The Global Footprint Network has used and established ecological footprint standards that are based on 230 extensive national footprint accounts with consumption land use matrices and complex life cycle assessments. And it suggests that we need to stabilize the population that is at a level that's about half the most optimistic value now. So if we're currently living like we have 1.5 of these, how do we bring it down to just 1? One of the problems is that when for a prolonged period of time you live beyond the carrying capacity, this overshoot problem, what happens is you can degrade the air and the other resources of the Earth to the point where it becomes more difficult to achieve the level that is at the carrying capacity, and it becomes less attainable. Well, so I've mentioned population and carrying capacity and greenhouse gases. And a key link between population and carrying capacity is the production of greenhouse gases. And we typically use carbon dioxide as the one that's most representative. So I'm going to take a moment and switch to a different piece of software here. And this is obviously a map of the Earth. And in this software, the various geographical areas of the Earth are color-coded. So we have the Americas in this yellow-green color. Europe and Central Asia is in the orange. Red is East Asia and the Pacifics. Africa is in the dark blue, and South Asia is in the light blue color. And I'm going to look at a plot of yearly CO2 emissions, and this is in the units of thousands of metric tons. So here when it says 8 million, that's really 8 billion. And then down here we've got population total for the Earth. And I've selected the United States, China, and India to look at over time. So the size of the circle indicates the population at the time, and you'll see these go. So I'm going to play this forward in time, starting with 1900. And so as time goes on, you can see the United States rather quickly starts to increase its CO2 emission as industry builds in the U.S. Meanwhile, India and China are increasing their population, but not accompanied by a substantial increase in the utilization of energy for industry and CO2. The U.S. continues on, and these spikes that come and go with events in the country's efforts. The 60s is a huge boost for production of CO2 in the U.S. Meanwhile, India and China continue to grow their populations to high levels, but then starting in about the late 1990s, China goes very dramatically forward with production of carbon dioxide. Now, production of carbon dioxide might mean increased industrial productivity, or it might mean increased urbanization, but it also does not bode well for the planet. When we have China here today at about 9 billion metric tons of CO2 annually, India at about 2.25, and the U.S. up here at about 5.4. Now, of course, if you think about per capita, with these population numbers, you can see the U.S. is at a much higher level of CO2 production per capita. If we deselect these and focus in on some of the other countries, just to get a perspective on it, you can see that this is Europe, this is Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa barely shows up in terms of their CO2 production. So any treaty or any efforts that deal with controlling carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases needs to include China, India, US, and Russia as well. Okay, so population and greenhouse gas emissions have increased, pushing the Earth to her limits. What about the temperature? And we're talking about global climate change, which we used to call global warming when all we thought was happening was temperature. Of course, now it's expanded, but the temperature is an important part of this. So the bottom figure here shows the bars indicating temperature and the line indicating CO2 concentration on the right axis since 1880. And this is the average temperature over land and oceans. Now, the temperatures are referenced to this period between 1901 and 2000 for comparison. There's a clear long-term global warming trend with temperatures increasing, and I think everyone can see that. And this coincides quite dramatically with the CO2 concentration. CO2 is a long-term effect, and temperature tends to fluctuate with natural processes such as El Nino events and volcanoes. So the figure on the top here shows a regional view of where this temperature increase is occurring. And the surface temperature increases are largely in the northern hemisphere, and so the focus has been on understanding this in the northern hemisphere. However, this is 2008 data. There was very little data from Antarctica at this time, and since then there's been a lot of filling in data from the southern hemisphere as well. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was organized the year I came to the University of Iowa. There's no correlation between that. Under the United Nations Environment Program. And currently there's 800 climate scientists that are working on the IPCC fifth assessment report due out later this fall. And this report is designed to provide an update of knowledge on the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic aspects of climate change. And based on the publications that it draws from, it's expected to show a greater than anticipated expansion of climate change indicators. So the fifth assessment report was recently released to peer reviewers to review the science, and of course, as with everything else, parts of it got leaked to the press. And so the Guardian had this to say about it after looking at leaked parts of the report. The new report will describe how climate changes are continuing without abatement. In particular, temperatures are rising, oceans are heating, waters are rising, ice is melting, the oceans are acidifying, heat is even moving to the deepest parts of the oceans. And it concludes that these changes are largely human-caused. Now, the New York Times, reading their parts of the leaked report, stated that the report forecast planet warming of about 5 degrees Fahrenheit or 2.8 degrees Celsius if the CO2 levels double. And a doubling would be to 560 parts per million, and we expect to reach that before 2050. This report will also describe how Arctic ice has been lost surprisingly quickly, and this is new since the last report. Although there were some hints to this put forward in the IPCC fourth report that used data from 1960 to 2005. And so here's some of those data summarized. So the air temperatures in the polar latitudes were increasing over time. The sea extent was decreasing. The permafrost was melting. And importantly, glacier mass balance was shown to be already declining dramatically. The fourth assessment report also highlighted the 10 indicators of a warming world that were going to be monitored. And those are largely the temperatures, temperature over land, temperature over oceans, and temperatures in the troposphere. As well, the loss of glaciers, the melting of snow cover and sea ice, contributing to increasing sea surface temperatures, increasing ocean heat content, and importantly, increasing sea levels. The other part of this is humidity. And humidity is important for the topic ahead in the next few minutes. But we know that a warmer world is a more humid world because the amount of water vapor that the air can hold increases as a function of temperature. And everybody knows this. But in a warmer world, precipitation events tend to be concentrated into more intense events as well. Now, indeed, the global data that's been compiled so far shows increases in extreme rain events for the Northern Hemisphere. And here are data from the U.S. Global Change Research Program that look at the period 1958 to 2007, and it shows large increases in extreme precipitation events. So those who have the sense that when it rains more than it used to are on the mark. So for the upper Midwest region, we've seen a 31% increase in the extreme events, which are defined as the heaviest 1% of all daily events. And for the New England area, this is a 67% increase. Well, when I was a kid, I enjoyed reading adventure stories, and a series of stories that captivated me were about the search for the Northwest Passage. And many of you are familiar with all the tales and the folk songs and sea shanties that came from that. Well, on August 21st, 2007, for the first time in recorded history, the Northwest Passage became open to large ships without the need for an icebreaker. These are NASA photos on the right, satellite photos from the Terra project. And they show the ice retreating rapidly between mid-July of last year and early August in the Peary Channel. And this is part of that famous Northwest Passage that was sought by polar explorers, most notably Roald Amundsen at the start of the 20th century. Sir John Franklin and Robert McClure endured a lot of misery trying to get through here. Roald Amundsen's 8 colleagues here on the fishing boat that made it through took 3 years to do so, and today they could sail right through in about a week. So loss of sea ice is the big story, and it's been getting a lot of press lately. A big story has been this worldwide retreat of the glaciers. And this has been occurring at an alarming rate, and it was captured dramatically in the images of the celebrated photographer James Balog, who spoke at this podium last April 4th, for those of you who were lucky enough to attend that and look at his beautiful photographs. Well, I think the press tends to talk a lot about the climate deniers, but there's a mounting group of climate scientists who are critical of the IPCC consensus process and saying it's too conservative. And one way to look at that is in the loss of sea ice. So the IPCC models suggest a loss of 50% of the sea ice, and that's shown in the plot looking at the consolidation of all the models, suggesting this amount of sea ice, whereas the direct observations are suggesting a loss of 88% from 28,000 cubic kilometers, which was the value back in 1900, to a mere 3,400 cubic kilometers today. So, of course, this loss of sea ice is important to people who live at or near sea level and see the water rising. So, I think the climate story is, in a way, pretty simple. Global climate change is upon us. We appear to have exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth. And so we have to think about how to both mitigate and adapt if we are to survive. So with that backdrop, I'd like to turn now to talk about respiratory health effects of climate change. And for this, I'd like to focus on allergens, air pollutants, as well as mold exposures that arise after flooding events, the type of floods that we see occurring more frequently and with greater severity over time. Well, are there any gardeners in the room? For you, this might be a familiar map. This is the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map, and this has been used for decades to decide what plants will thrive in a given geographic area. And so we had been watching for this this new version for several years. We knew that one was in the making, and when it was released based on much better set of data than had been used before. And when I took a look at this, I noticed something right away. So I pulled out the 1990 map and compared the two, and what I found is that it now classifies Iowa as Zone 5A and 5B, whereas the 1990 map that was limited to data from 1974 to 1986 had us classified as 4-5. This suggests that at least a 5-degree Fahrenheit and perhaps a 10-degree Fahrenheit warming in our winter low temperatures across the state. And if you look at other parts of the country, you can see a similar warming. Well, this is important because this is not just talking about climate, it's talking about what grows here. And this plant on the right, many will recognize, particularly at this time of year, that's the common ragweed. And this is one that thrives in warmer climates. So at warmer temperatures, compounded with higher CO2 concentrations, we expect changes in the growth of allergenic plants. To look at this, there have been a number of groups that have created atmospheres of 2050 in climate chambers and then grown plants. And when they do that, what they find is the plants grow bigger, they produce more pollen, and the pollen grains they produce contain more allergens. Thus, we expect longer and more severe allergy seasons in the future climate. And of course, if you're allergic to any of these or allergic to the species that will be moving into our area, that's bad news for you. Turning to air pollution, ozone is a toxic air pollutant and perhaps one of the most important in terms of lung disease. And it's regulated under the Clean Air Act by the EPA. It's a secondary pollutant that's formed in the air when the ultraviolet light from the sun strikes nitrogen oxide and volatile organics on the surface of particulates, and which catalyze the chemical reactions that create the ozone. This is a reaction that's dependent upon temperature. So the higher the temperature, such as in urban heat islands, the more ozone that will be produced. Thus, when we see these extreme heat events, particularly in urban areas where there's air pollution, we see more ozone produced. And the combination of the ozone and the heat stress combine to lead to morbidity and mortality of the people who live there. And this was very dramatically seen in the August 2003 French heat wave that killed 14,800 people in Paris and surrounding areas. So many studies have documented the toxicity of ozone and the associated morbidity and mortality. We know that breathing ozone damages lung tissue. We know that it results in reduced lung function and inflammation of the airways. It can increase respiratory symptoms and aggravate asthma and other pre-existing lung diseases. It's particularly harmful to children and the elderly who suffer more when there are these urban air inversion events, and also affects outdoor workers, kids who go out to play sports after school, and people with underlying lung and heart disease. We also know that it's associated with increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, and this leads people to seek care at emergency departments and from physicians, and also seen with increased hospital admissions. So there's a very clear association between ozone, urban air, heat events, and mortality. So when we kind of try to put this together, look at all these things, we find up on the top here increasing CO2 and temperature suggests that we're going to have longer allergy seasons, perhaps new species, and higher problems with allergy and asthma. Down here with ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide, we'll see increased lung inflammation, which makes one more susceptible to the problems shown up here. And then we have this other picture, which is increased exposure to molds associated with increasing floods and humidity. So this takes me to disasters. Turns out that there's something called the International Disaster Data Center that collects data worldwide and is supported by USAID and the World Health Organization. And here's data from 1900 to the present showing increases in climate disasters. Now, this figure shows the number of disasters in 9 categories that might be hard for you to read from the back, but the first is droughts here, floods, landslides, storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, epidemics, and other. And in particular, you'll notice the big increases over the last 40 years or so in floods and storms as disasters. This bar here shows the scale for 200 disasters. So you see for floods, we're going from tens or dozens of disasters per year up to more than 200 flood disasters each year. This is data from the United States from 1980 to 2011. And this is from the U.S. National Climatic Data Center, which tracks disasters that cause $1 billion or more of damage. And this plot is showing the data from 1980 up to 2011, shown on the x-axis. And on the left axis here are the number of events, which are the bars. The blue bars show at the time of the event. The red is adjusted for Consumer Price Index. And then the line, the blue and red lines show the damage amounts in billions of dollars associated with those events. It's apparent that both the number of events and the monetary losses are increasing over time. And you can look at this for other countries and you'll see the same story. Now, I'd like to highlight one or two of these in particular. It turns out that 8 years ago today, Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. So I suppose it's appropriate to be talking about this subject on this day. Although there were only $5 billion events that year, the losses, both in terms of human life and suffering, but also monetary, were very, very substantial. The Iowa flood of 2008 occurred in a year where there were $9 billion disasters in the U.S., and you can see the total damages associated with those were somewhere around $60 billion. Now, over this whole period, there have been 53 flood and hurricane billion-dollar events, all of which led to high exposures to mold and other inhalation hazards. What about 2012? Well, that's not such a distant memory for us. Looking at the 2012 data, there were $11 billion events, 377 deaths, and total cost was $115 billion. We remember the severe drought and heat wave that went on last summer in the Midwest, causing $30 billion of damage and 123 deaths. And then, of course, Superstorm Sandy, which occurred in October 2012 with almost $66 billion in losses. Now, it's important to note that at the time the ocean, that Hurricane Sandy struck, the ocean temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, which is an extremely anomalous temperature, very likely due to climate change effects. The heat of the water provides a lot more energy for the storm, and so as we see these temperatures in the Gulf and on the eastern seaboard increase, we can expect more of these severe storms. Recovery from Sandy will take many, many years, and we hope it will be done in a way that will make that area more resilient to future storms, which certainly will come. Well, getting closer to home here, in 2010, a group of professors from the Iowa Regents Universities were charged by the legislature to create a report, and the product of that was Climate Change Impacts on Iowa, which was presented to the governor and the Iowa General Assembly on January 1, 2011. Now, in this report, we studied data from 1896 to 2008, and we found increases in summer dew points, in the total annual precipitation, and in the number of frost-free days, which indicated on average a growing season that had increased in length by 8 days. We also observed an increase in what we called very wet days, which were days with over 3 centimeters or 1.2 inches of rain in 24 hours. We now know that those are becoming pretty common events. And April 18th of this year, I'm sure you will all remember, if you forgot your umbrella, most of eastern Iowa received 4 inches of rain in 24 hours, and some places received as much as 8 inches of rain in one event. These things just didn't happen back 60 to 80 years ago. Now, according to a report I heard the other day from the state climatologist, Harry Hilliker, May of 2013 was the wettest month in 141 years of record keeping. But now here we are in August, and August 2013 will be the driest on record for eastern Iowa, especially Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. Well, many of you lived through the hardships of the flood of 2008 and experienced that firsthand. And some of you may have lost your home or been made sick by this event. How this came about is shown on the right. This is really the anatomy of such a flood. We had an unusually wet fall, and the winter of 2007 to 2008 deposited an average of 11 inches of snow across the state, and much of the state on the ground. And you can see on this top plot, this is the snow when it came and how much was on the ground at any given time. The air temperature was below freezing, but when it went above freezing, it tended to stay there. And so very rapidly we had snow melt. And this came on top of some pretty significant April rains. And so the Cedar Rapids, the Cedar River at Cedar Rapids and the Iowa River at Marengo, as shown here, had some small flooding in March and April before the real catastrophic and spectacular flooding of June that came when we had these torrential rains, which the 20-day rainfall totals that fell statewide, but especially in the watershed of the Iowa River and the Cedar River, were 1 in 1,000 events. So very, very unusual. Well, the result of this type of thing is a home that looks like this. This is a home that's been flooded up to the line you can see on the wall. So mold is taking over the floors, the carpets, the upholstery, the furniture. And interestingly, for those who aren't used to this, most of the mold you see grows above the water line. You had saturated wallboard, and this flooded home needed basically to be totally gutted and rebuilt. Now, molds are very important to the world. They're the great recyclers of all organic matter. They're a diverse group within the family of fungal species. And they grow mycelia, which are, in this case, this is supposed to represent in this drawing a wallboard. And so the mycelia grow into that, and as they're growing, they produce volatile organic chemicals that are smelly, and usually unpleasantly so, but in the case of some cheeses, quite delightfully smelly. And they also produce spores, and these spores are the way that the molds propagate and disseminate themselves throughout the environment. And in some cases, these remain airborne and they're produced by the millions. And in particular, the genera of Aspergillus and Penicillium produce bountiful spores that are just the right size to be inhaled and travel deeply into the lung and produce lung inflammation and respiratory diseases. And they grow well on, guess what? Damp carpet, upholstery, cellulose, that's as wet papers, and wallboard. Now, when they do that, they produce a variety of pulmonary conditions. And these are things that are seen in patients after flooding, where people have increases in mold allergies. Sometimes these are people who were allergic already, but their allergies got worse. Sometimes it's new allergy. Exacerbations and new onset of asthma, inflammation of the mucous membranes, and toxic alveolitis. And these can occur simultaneously. For instance, these last two are often seen together. There's this one in the middle, Katrina cough and the flood crud. It's not really a recognized medical syndrome. However, it's what people complain about when they seek medical care after flood. Katrina cough was what they called it in New Orleans. Flood crud is what we heard in Cedar Rapids. These persisted for months and months, and in many cases left people quite ill. Well, we were doing studies in homes in New Orleans a month after the flood, so that's 8 years, 1 month less than 8 years ago. And this leather chair was from a home that we studied, and this is a remarkable chair. It was a leather chair, probably horsehair for the filling, and it was a mycologist's dream, but a homeowner's nightmare. I got really excited because it's got 42 different species of mold growing on it, and they're quite putrid smelling. And when we cultured those in the laboratory, when we opened those culture plates, it smelled just like the chair. But you can imagine what it's like if you have to haul this to the curb without proper protection of your health. So we discourage people from doing that, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Well, because of our experience with Katrina, when the flood of 2008 came, we were ready to study subjects in the flooded homes in Cedar Rapids. We enrolled 73 subjects. We measured a whole host of things in the air in their homes before and during and after remediation. We collected health and demographic data. And fortunately, we found that the exposures in these homes were much, much lower than what we had seen in the homes in New Orleans, likely because these weren't underwater as long, it isn't as hot here, and people were able to get in and start mucking and gutting these homes quite early. We did see higher levels of bacteria, molds, and their products during remediation than after the remediation, suggesting that the contractors had done a good job of fixing up these homes. But in addition, we saw a higher prevalence of diagnosed allergy and allergic rhinitis for those who were in homes that were still undergoing remediation. And then comparing to before the flood and after the flood, we found that subjects had odds ratio or a 3.8-fold higher wheezing than they had before the flood. So the message from this was that cleaning out wet and moldy debris after a flood is dangerous. It requires special equipment and should be done by professionals with respiratory protection that goes well beyond what you can buy at a hardware store. It should not be done without this special equipment and special knowledge. On a larger scale, the other message was that we need to build more resilient communities that are located in less vulnerable areas as we expect to see more floods in the future. So we need to adapt and we need to mitigate. And as greenhouse gas emissions increase and increase the problems of climate change, this is going to have significant impacts on humans and ecosystems. And what is a big concern, of course, is that the poor nations that are now developing want to be prosperous, but we want to help them develop in a way that minimizes the impacts on humans so that we don't have to go through this and repeat this cycle of having economic development tied to producing more greenhouse gases as we go on. Now, when you think about the climate problem, it often seems that the current plan, what we call Plan A, is business as usual until the climate apocalypse. And I don't want to leave you with that thought. So let's talk about Plan B. 4 simple steps, can be done, but it's going to take a lot of action of the global community. We need to make massive cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, and the recommendation from the World Watch Institute is this be an 80% cut by 2020. We need to stabilize world populations. We need to eradicate global poverty. And we need to restore our forests, soils, aquifers, and fisheries. So how do we execute Plan B? Well, some things we can do. We can raise energy efficiency worldwide, especially in those countries that are already producing large amounts of greenhouse gases. We need to restructure transportation systems, and we need to move from fossil fuels to renewables, wind, solar, and things we haven't thought of yet. Number 2 and number 3 will have to come together. So we need to provide primary education for all children, especially girls. This is an important thing to stabilize our world population. We need to provide basic community-level hygiene and health care, and we need to provide women access to family planning services and de-incentivize having large families in places where that still is a practice. And for 4, we need to restore forests, soils, and aquifers. We need to increase water productivity and become far more efficient with our irrigation. There's a lot of work going on in that area. We need to use more water-efficient crops, and cities need to start continuously recycling water. And that's a challenging thought. We need to ban deforestation worldwide and plant 1 billion trees. We need to use known technology to control erosion. And we need to employ sustainable agriculture and develop sustainable fisheries. So Plan B is challenging, and it's a global effort. So what can we do as individuals, and what can you do today? Well, one thing you can do is look at your own carbon footprint, and then make sustainable choices based on your data in your daily life. And so for that, I recommend you go to www.epa.gov and follow the links to their footprint calculator. That will give you a good start. But by looking at the U.S. average data, you can get a pretty good idea of what things are important. The big sources of greenhouse gas emissions are motor vehicle fuels and electricity. Other significant sources that you can think about are natural gas for heating, healthcare, and meat consumption. And you might wonder about meat consumption. Well, livestock and their manure produce lots of methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse forcing gas. So, to reduce our carbon footprint, we can turn off lights and appliances. I'm talking to my daughters now. Turn off lights and appliances. Use more efficient lighting and install home solar energy systems. So I brought a prop here. This is an LED light bulb. It costs $12. It is the equivalent of a 60-watt incandescent bulb, and it uses 6 watts. It lasts 25 years, which is far longer. This is just one type of technology that's evolving that can help us, and we need to embrace these when they come online. This photo here shows an Iowa City garage where 8 solar panels are generating 1/3 of the electricity needed for a family of 2 parents and 2 lovely teenagers. We're able to do this thanks to a 30% federal tax and a 15% state tax credit that was introduced by Senator Joe Bolcom, who's here in the audience, and was signed into law by Governor Branstad. I don't think he could make it. But you pay only half of the installed cost, so this is great. And so we've got a link on our website here, ehsrc.org, and you can follow that to photovoltaic solar installation, and it can tell you how to do this, or you can just talk to me. I'm pretty enthusiastic, as you might discern. Well, other things, transportation is a major source of greenhouse gases. To reduce our consumption of fuel, there's a number of tips. We can drive a more fuel-efficient vehicle. We can find alternative modes of transportation. I love the bicycle. And we can fly less often. We also need to think about eating locally grown foods, planting a garden, and we need to promote primary prevention because healthcare is a very energy-intensive endeavor. Importantly, we need to support candidates for elected office who understand the threat of climate change and who embrace the concepts of sustainability. The other thing we need to do is plant trees and let them propagate. And as my favorite farmer poet, Wendell Berry, wrote, invest in the millennium, plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant and that you will not live to harvest. So, some people may fear the move towards a sustainable world, just as people feared Goliath in that ancient story. We need to be brave. We need to strive for sustainability joyfully, with wonder, and with a spirit of adventure and discovery. We also need to approach this with the realization that a sustainable world will be a much better world than the one that we live in today. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and thank you very much. Yes, and I'm told that there's Sir Dan McMillan has a microphone that he will bring to you so that everyone can hear your question. There it comes. Yes.
So, Peter, none of that stuff's going to happen. The politicians aren't going to do anything. The world's going to get really bad before anything happens. So, is there something else we can do? Should we be? I mean,
Okay,
can we dig some
for those
holes
who
to get
didn't
in the
hear
ground or
it,
something?
The optimism I tried to leave you with is not at all shared by everyone, including Cliff. A couple things I would say to that. One, there are some things that we can control. So we can do those things at the end that I pointed to. And sometimes you do what you can do, right? You vote for the right person. You advocate for the people who are going to support adaptation and mitigation. And then you do the things you can, like plant a garden and turn off the lights and so forth. Beyond that, there's, I think, a new sense of optimism. There was speaking of Al Gore earlier, there was an interview with Al Gore the other day, and I think he has his pulse on Washington better than I do. And he's saying that the voice of the climate deniers is going away. And he likened this to the movement that was seen with civil rights, with marriage equality, a number of things over time where the rhetoric changed eventually and then things moved along. So I think the United States is going to start to see some serious policy changes, including move towards some sort of a carbon tax, where maybe there'll be a relief of other taxes and instead imposition of a carbon tax. So I'm not as pessimistic as you are. Now, the thing that's important to recognize is that the CO2, if we curtailed production of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide today, it still goes up for some time because there's a lag period. And so no matter what we do to mitigate, we have to adapt. And that's going to take a lot of long-range planning and a lot of money. Yeah, there's a question in the back.
I was going to comment and also thank you so much for that great presentation. You know, the national leadership is paltry, but a lot of things are happening at the local level. A lot of this is happening from the ground up. So it's 25% of Iowa electricity generation is now from wind sources. So there's a lot going. There's a great website called climate.org that, I always get cheered up when I read it, actually, because there's a lot of, think we're doing something about it, and it's not totally hopeless.
That's an excellent point. You look at a state like Iowa, and if you go up to the north central part of the state, you'll see miles and miles of wind turbines. If you look at the local level, you can see the University of Iowa taking a leadership role in sustainability, where we're offsetting carbon in our heating and energy generation through burning oat hulls. At this point, the university has prevented the release of about 500,000 metric tons of CO2 through the oat hull project. So there's student coalitions, there's student groups, there's all kinds of ways to get involved and have an influence at the local level. And all of that is multiplying to cause some change in Washington. That's my belief and certainly my hope. Question up in the middle of the back there. I think the shy people today are in the front instead of the back.
Hi, kind of to follow up on his question. So there's a lot we can do as individuals, and there, as you said, independent organizations encouraging lifestyle changes, planting trees, etc. But do you think there should be some sort of an effort on educating those lawmakers who just outright deny climate change?
Yeah, so should we have an effort to educate lawmakers? We have done some of that. The center that I direct, for instance, has held 4 legislative workshops with state legislators and their staff to talk about issues that are of importance in environmental health. So that's one such approach, and that kind of thing happens. There certainly are a lot of lobbyists on all sides of the issue that are trying to educate congressmen and senators. And I think the voices of the normal folks should be heard when they come back to their districts. And anytime you have an opportunity to talk about climate change and mitigation and adaptation to an elected official, that's a good opportunity that you should take.